Hi, everyone. This is Marcela Diaz with Somos un Pueblo Unido. Thank you for participating in today's press briefing with Latinos Decisions regarding the education polling. I just wanted to ask all of the folks on the attendees list to write next to your name, rename yourself, and make sure that you put the news outlet that you're with so that we can keep track and send you follow-up information. Also, I am just wanting to also let you know that we'll have plenty of times for questions at the end. It's not that long of a presentation that Dr. Gabriel Sanchez will be making for you. And so there is a Q&A function, just raise your hand and we will be sure that Javier Martinez, who will be moderating today's press briefing, can call on you at the end of the presentation. And with that, I just want to go ahead and turn it over to Javier Martinez from the Partnership for Community Action.
Thank you, Marcela, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. I'm Javier Martinez, Executive Director of Partnership for Community Action, and I'm joined today by Marcela Diaz from Somos un Pueblo Unido, Joanna Bencomo, Executive Director of New Mexico Cafe, Adrian Pedrosa, the National Director of Strategic Partnerships for Abriendo Puertas, and Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, who's a principal and a researcher with the polling firm Latino Decisions. Today, we're here to present the results of a survey that was conducted in June of 480 Latino parents in the state of New Mexico with regard to the challenges and the opportunities of reopening our schools here in New Mexico. As we all know, schools were shut down in the middle of March due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Schools went into a distance learning mode for the remainder of the school year. And over the last few weeks, the state public education department and school districts across the state have been working with parents, teachers, and other decision makers to decide in what fashion schools will reopen this year. The survey was commissioned by the organizations that are here represented, as well as by the New Mexico Voices for Children and El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, who are also on this call, but not as panelists, as attendees. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Gabriel Sanchez to present the results of the survey.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some of the results from this survey that you see was commissioned by the organizations that were referenced. I'd like to take just a second to note that these organizations worked together quickly and collaboratively to be able to commission this poll at a time where everybody was thinking about what school reentry would look like in the fall and what challenges Latino families might have faced in the transition to online education in the spring, but didn't have many answers. So I think the fact that they worked together quickly and really were thinking about all these decisions being data-driven was critically important, because a lot of these questions, unfortunately, nobody else had data to really utilize to help districts across the state make the decisions that they need to make as we think about returning to school in the fall. Talk a little bit about survey methodology. I will note that there's a lot of information available about the survey, full results, a much longer PowerPoint presentation than I'll share with you today, as well as the full top lines at latinodecisions.com. If you go to our website, you'll see polls and research, a tab on the top. You click on that, you'll be able to see the New Mexico Family Study and be able to pull all of those resources. So don't worry about feverishly catching notes now. You can see the full slide deck and any of the other information that you might need. I'll talk a little bit more about methodology if folks have questions at the end of my presentation, but you see just south of 500 Hispanic parents of children 18 years of age or younger. I will say it was also inclusive of grandparents that might be the primary caregivers of their children, so it's a pretty comprehensive sample. We made sure that we used a blended approach to capture as many of our families across the state of New Mexico as possible. That included online surveys, live telephone interviews, conducted with both landline and cell phone numbers. And all of our team at Latino Decisions that does interviewing is fully bilingual, so respondents have the opportunity to respond in English or Spanish at their preference. And you see the overall margin of error for our survey was very low and in line with what you would expect from Latino Decisions projects. We matched the overall sample demographics of the survey to what the US Census defines for Hispanic parents across the state of New Mexico to make sure that the data is representative of all Latino families. And you see that the survey was conducted June 4th through June 12th and averaged about 20 minutes in length. So this was a very long survey. And I think the fact that so many Hispanic families were willing to share their opinions with us is reflective of people wanting to have their voice considered as districts make their decisions about schooling for the fall. As noted, I'm going to focus almost extensively on the attitudes and experiences of Latino parents across the state of New Mexico in regard to education. That's obviously the topic of the hour, with everybody recognizing that the transition to education in the fall is starting to be solidified now. First question that we asked folks, and this was in an open-ended format where respondents could basically tell us in their own words what they felt were the biggest challenges or issues specific to their children's education that they think should be addressed by our state government. You see that childcare, right? Combining access to quality childcare while school is out and access to daycare and early learning, when combined, 41% of respondents felt that was a critically important issue state government should address. And you see another major theme we're going to address today is access to internet and technology. That has been a gaping challenge that we've seen across our survey that I'll give you some specific data points to reinforce. And 36% noting that more information about how school will operate in the fall is key. So thinking about these themes, it's going to be childcare and access to it, access to better and more available technology, including just basic access to the internet, and more information about how schools are going to operate, and communication from schools about how their children are doing in the fall are going to be some of the major themes that we tackle in more depth, that were again referenced by the families themselves, putting this in their own words as the biggest challenges that they're facing and are they're thinking about. One of the overarching data points that we saw across the survey is this high level of concern that Latino families have about their children spending too much time away from school and or not learning enough from online schooling. So there's this great concern. You see over 80% of families noting that their children might be falling behind as a result of both the transition to distance learning, as well as just not being in the classroom physically for as long of a period of time as we've already faced. When we asked follow-up questions and asked folks specifically about subject matter, they had the greatest concern about their children falling behind in. You see math was overwhelmingly the greatest concern among parents, and this was also the subject that parents did not feel capable assisting their children with. So thinking about math, and secondary to that, science are key subject matter areas as we think about the fall that we should provide extra support for families to be able to help their children through those difficult subject areas. One positive for our state school system is, especially when we compare this with our national numbers of Latino families across the country, there's pretty high approval rating, 80% you see in approval for the way children's schools have handled the transition to distance learning as a result of the virus pandemic. I think this is reflective of the fact that although you'll see across the survey, Latino parents faced a lot of challenges and have a lot of concerns about what distance learning is going to look like, they recognize that the state is operating under very difficult conditions and with not a lot of time to prepare. So I think that's one positive for the way our state has handled things. But as you'll see, there's a lot of recommendations Latino parents have about how things can be done better as we think about preparing for the fall. You see here, we asked specifically about precautions that schools could or should make to make things safer for both educators and students, their children obviously, in the fall. And you see across the board, there's majority support from Latino families of all of these recommendations, some of which have already been solidified in terms of the plan that the state and districts have for transitioning back to school in the fall. This includes almost universal support for having classrooms extensively cleaned every day and requiring both teachers and students to wear masks at all times to prevent the spread of the virus. Fortunately, the wearing of masks has become common practice. And I think as we think about moving back into the fall, it's pretty clear that Latino families recognize the importance of mask wearing to reduce the spread of the virus. You also see high level of support for staggering school days to minimize or reduce class sizes. High level of support, 81%, for a mix of in-person attendance and distance learning. So that hybrid model we're all hearing a lot about has a lot of support from Latino families. And interestingly, there's wide support, 69% you see here, for extending the school year to help kids catch up with their studies. Again, note, a lot of families have high levels of concern that their kids are falling behind, so taking aggressive steps to be able to ensure that they're able to catch up, including extending the school year, as well as longer school days to help kids make up some ground, are high levels of support from Latino families across the state. And even though I will say that continuing with distance learning did not have high levels of support and is met with a lot of concern from Latino families, they do recognize that if this is needed because of the fear of COVID spreading or spiking in the fall, you do see that 63% of Latino families would support that under those conditions if it was our only option. As noted, one of the big themes that emerged from the survey was challenges with digital divide and basic access to not only Wi-Fi or high-speed internet, but just internet in general, as well as other online tools to be able to support their children with distance learning. So the survey asked a number of specific questions about digital divide issues. And this data should be taken within the context of New Mexico, as many of you know, being one of the states with the greatest level of digital divide across the country and the highest percentage of individuals who don't have regular access to Wi-Fi in their home. That is reflected in our survey of Latino families. You see that a pretty sizable segment, 28%, so that's more than 1 in 4 Hispanic households across the state, only have access to internet through their cell phone, and 21% do not have regular access to the net, period, at home. And you see this was even higher among our immigrant families. 30% indicated that they do not have regular access to the internet. So when you combine those two things in an environment where using high-speed internet is incredibly important for being able to support children's education, not only do some families, a sizable 1 out of every 5, not have access, period, those that only have internet access to their cell phone, that's incredibly challenging when you're trying to navigate the software that most school districts are going to require for families if we have to move back to distance learning in the fall. When we asked folks for any specific challenges they've had in the spring with homeschooling, and again, using this information to try to think ahead to what some of this might look like in the fall, you see 74% of Latino families across the state indicate that online schooling has made it hard to communicate with teachers and that learning is much more difficult now. A lot of folks in the survey indicated that they want more communication from schools, even if that has to be virtual, and ideally having more of that one-on-one with their family and the teacher whenever possible. We also saw 50%, so 1 out of every 2 Latino households across the state indicate they do not have enough computers, tablets, or laptops for everybody in the household. Keep in mind, as many folks are having to move to working from home, even if they have one computer or one tablet, that has to be shared across those individuals that are attempting to work from home, as well as multiple children that might be needing that one machine or mechanism to do distance learning. So you think about that as a gaping challenge across the state, even for those individuals who do have access to the internet. It does not mean that they are fully equipped to be able to do virtual learning at a high level of success. And you also see 44% of Latino families indicate that online schooling or work has been difficult because of technical problems, whether the websites are not working or the programs themselves are not working or not compatible with the equipment that they have. Computers, for example, at home was another significant challenge. Again, all of these things being identified early hopefully gives school districts a little bit of time to prepare and hopefully communicate what can be done to assist families as we think about returning to school in the fall. Drilling down a little bit more deeply into computer and software needs, you see that 62% of Latino families indicate that having a computer provided by the school would be very effective for helping improve their overall experience and their children's experience with distance learning in the fall. And another sizable segment, 75%, indicate that being able to have updated software to be up to date with what the children are being expected to use at home from the school district is also important. So you put these two things together, and I think it reveals a really important finding. And that is, even for individuals who are able to access a computer from the school district, if it is not already loaded with the necessary software, a lot of families had challenges being able to make those things sync. And as a consequence, even if they had a computer provided by the school. If it wasn't functional because the software didn't sync, it was almost as though they didn't have a computer. So again, I think this gives us some opportunity to think ahead and hopefully make sure that whatever computers go out are already equipped with the software that is needed, and we actually train some of these families with utilizing this more effectively so that those resources can be employed effectively. One segue to a much wider set of content in the survey, stressing the economic challenges that Latino families across the state are having in the context of COVID, is the fact that we see a large segment of Latino families indicate in the survey that their internet or cell phone bill is much higher now because people in their home are working, we're doing school online, we're putting a lot more stress on that system. And unfortunately, for 44% of Latino families, this is actually being an economic burden for them at a difficult time economically for Latino families. Unfortunately, when we followed up with these folks and asked, is anybody supporting this added cost, whether it was their employer, a school district, anybody else, the vast majority said no, they're having to shoulder this economic burden themselves. So again, I think it's a nice segue to think about the economic impact that these folks are facing on top of all of the education challenges that they have as well. We're already seeing some of this anecdotally, that when we start to think about concerns in the context of returning to the fall with homeschooling or going to that model, at some point during the academic year, you see 76% of Latino families indicate they're very concerned about that transition process for all of those challenges that we've seen already reflected in the data. So it's met with a lot of concern. I think as we get closer to the start of the fall semester, families are going to see even increased concerns and stress just thinking about the challenges they had in the spring. One thing to keep note of is that we're already seeing a large segment of Latino families not sending their children to summer programs, whether that be camps or childcare that they would ordinarily sign them up for. Although some of this is obviously in the context of sports camps, more recreational. Keep in mind, for a lot of Latino families, they engage their children in whatever summer programs they can to improve their academic standing and make sure there's not a big drop-off over the summer in their learning capacity. So with basically 1 out of every 2 Latino families, for good reason, not signing their students up for those opportunities, we're going to see a lot of our Latino students come back to the classroom in the fall, not as prepared as they normally would because they're not taking advantage of any opportunities during the summer to be able to improve on their overall education. Even more alarming is the potential drop in student enrollment that we might see because of the fear of COVID-19. You see that overall, there's 35% of Latino families in this survey indicating that they're strongly considering not sending their children back to school in the fall. And you see when we break that out across different subgroups of the overall survey sample, you see that's significantly higher by 10% for individuals who are Spanish-speaking families. And you also see that we have a variation in terms of children's ages. We were able to track that in the survey. And so ages 5 to 10, you see a little bit higher than across some other age groups, but I put that on there mainly to emphasize that regardless of what age the children are in the household, you still see roughly 1/3 of all segments of the sample indicating they are strongly considering not sending their children back in the fall. So just take note what that will mean for our overall education system and these families if their children are not in the school in the fall. That's a to be determined question, but I think gives us some sense of the severity and the concern that Latino families have about returning to school in the fall in the context of COVID-19, particularly when we're starting to see spikes in overall positive cases here in the state of New Mexico. When we asked families specifically, how can schools help your kids catch up and not fall behind, you see again stressing that overall theme of more communication. Not only in terms of what education will look like in the fall, but specifically more communication on the assignments and the expectations that the school districts have for their children. We saw in the survey a lot of families noting that they did not have enough information on whether or not they were up to par with their students' performance, how are things going. I think that basic level of communication is highly valued among Latino families, and you see more in-person time with teachers. In fact, the survey also indicated that folks recognize that might have to be done virtually through Zoom, through the telephone or other online platforms, but families want that direct communication with teachers about how their children are doing. And high levels of support and concern for more one-on-one tutoring available for their children. Again, keep in mind, specifically in the subject areas of math and science, a lot of Latino parents don't feel they're equipped to be able to support their children in those subject areas. And so having more one-on-one time for tutoring is, again, something hopefully we can prepare for as we think about returning to school in the fall. And then finally, last couple of slides for you as we think about how engaging parents and families might be more challenging in the context of COVID-19. Roughly half of Latino families across the state are planning to participate less in any in-person parent meetings, group discussions, any convenings, any of those things that are done in person for good reason. Latino parents are saying they're probably not going to participate as much, obviously wanting to reduce the spread of COVID-19. However, 66% of those same families indicate they will look for any virtual participation opportunities, whether those be in parent meetings, group discussions, convenings. So in essence, although they're not excited about doing those things in person, they're hungry for opportunities to connect and be engaged with their young ones' education if that's done virtually. And as we tested a number of different forms of communication with parents, essentially asking them, how would you like the district or your child's school to communicate with you? Everything tested positively, from sending us emails, giving us phone calls on our cell phone, our home phone, posting that information to websites. Essentially everything tested positively except for calls to their employer. So as long as districts avoid making direct phone calls to their employment, every other form of communication tested positively, and we'd be met very positively from Latino families. So that concludes our presentation this morning. Again, latinodecisions.com on our polls and research tab. If you go there, you can pull a much longer slide deck that includes some of the economic challenges content of the survey, as well as the full top lines and a full report expanding on some of this discussion on education challenges that you can grab and hopefully utilize for your stories. Thank you very much. I think we have time for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. We appreciate the presentation. Members of the media, please use the raise hand function and we'll call on you so that you can ask your question of Dr. Sanchez. I will say that, you know, two recurring themes that we see here are the fact that Latino parents in New Mexico are supportive of many of the decisions that have been made at the local school district level as well as at the state level. We feel that those decisions have been sound and that families have really been listened to. Having said that, I think there are also some challenges that are going to present themselves, specifically if we end up you know, going into some sort of hybrid or full-time online education system. One of those is making sure that districts have the ability and really the willingness to engage families in meaningful ways. And the second one is making sure that families have the ability to navigate the technology that they will need to do in order for their children to receive the education they deserve. And this is especially important because, as we know, we're still in the middle of the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. There's some serious inequities that were identified by that lawsuit specifically for English language learners, Latino and Native American students. And so it's incumbent upon all of us, including our organizations, to collaborate to ensure that these kids receive the education that they are entitled to. So with that, I'd like to open it up to members of the media for any questions. And the first one on the list is Andy Lyman from the New Mexico Political Report.
Hi, yeah, I just sent this on the Q&A too, but considering these results and the ongoing Yazzie Martinez suit, what are the best solutions to balance these public health concerns with making sure that these children get access to education?
I can start, and if any of the organizations want to follow up with any specific suggestions that they have based on their interactions with the families that they support and they work with. I think a couple of things that jump out directly from the survey is, unfortunately, many of our families lack basic access to the internet, right? That's not news to anybody who's familiar with those challenges in the state of New Mexico. But if you think of the inequalities that were already present before COVID-19 hit as it relates to education access, for these families, especially thinking about a hybrid model or having to go fully online again in the fall, that time gap from being able to be equipped with the tools to be able to keep up with the education is just going to make those underlying inequalities much greater. So thinking about what strategies can be employed, a number of things are being done in other states that we can think about, whether that's putting hotspots across different communities in the state, thinking about other models that don't require high-speed internet to be able to continue education. I think we have a bit of time, but that time is shrinking to be able to make some aggressive steps possible to ensure that all children, not just those that have access to high-speed internet, are able to continue with their education.
This is Adrian with Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors. I would also add that, the individualized education approach is also, crucial for students and families that are potentially at risk for falling behind. What we're hearing from families is, as we're looking at distance learning solutions and using, technology and applications, that they very much, as Gabe pointed to the data, are wanting that individual still, and FaceTime, even if virtual, with teachers, and families and parents want that support to better understand what their children should be learning in a distance learning environment. So communication, as Gabe indicated over and over, is key. It's not enough just to send an app, just to send sort of weekly assignments. It's really important that families get that FaceTime directly with teachers and even individual tutors, especially to help make up the gap in learning that they might be experiencing in math and science, as Gabe indicated.
And what we know, one of the asks that our organization has made specifically of the Albuquerque Public Schools district is that they have some sort of technical assistance process, either through videos, through some sort of hotline that is obviously language adequate for people to use. One of the things we saw between the end of March and the end of May was that you had teachers pulling triple duty sometimes, teaching, social work and technical assistance for families to use the technology. And that's unfair. It's unfair for the teachers, it's unfair for the student, and it's unfair for the family. Andy, any follow-up?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody else on the list. This is being recorded and it will be shared with all members of the media through, through our Facebook channels and whatnot. I've got Bill Devin. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, now that I'm unmuted. I'm Bill Divin. I'm with the Sandoval Signpost in Placitas. We cover southeastern Sandoval County, Bernalillo, the Bernalillo School District. I'm wondering how this survey is being shared with individual districts.
Thank you, Bill, and I can take that, Dr. Sanchez. So the survey has been shared by our organizations, primarily the big school districts that, where we reside, where the organizations reside. We've presented it to APS, and I know that my colleagues at Somos Un Pueblo Unido and at New Mexico Cafe have shared it with their local school districts. We've also briefed the New Mexico PD. We had a briefing for them about 10 days ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, where we had the secretary, we had every deputy, and we had, I believe, every director of the PD. We had a big turnout for that. So everybody's been briefed on this already.
And I'll just add that I'd like to commend the organizations for trying to make the data as accessible as humanly possible. I think that's the whole goal of being data-driven, is making that data accessible. And as all of you are seeing, a number of other surveys come out across the state of families. One really important thing to note in our methodology is almost all of those surveys I've seen, at least, have been done fully online. And although that's great, and some of them have huge sample sizes, obviously it misses a huge segment of folks that we see in our poll don't have regular access to Wi-Fi, so couldn't complete a survey only online. So the methodology that we took of making sure we capture folks also on the telephone, make sure that we're hearing from all families, not just those that are already equipped to be able to do online education.
Bill, anything else from you?
That is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate you. Mayra Aguilar from Univision, you're on.
Thank you for taking my question. Sorry, I was muted. So after presenting this information to, let's say, APS or the other districts, what do they say? Are they willing to work with y'all to get some solutions, especially for those parents that have difficulties with the internet? Because we hear that a lot. We get a lot of questions like those with people not having the computer or having internet access, and also the parents that have to work, for those like the single parents, single moms.
That's a great question, Mayra. Thank you. And I'll speak for our organization, but if Marcela or Joanna from either of the other two want to comment as well. We have received commitments from APS and from the PD, quite frankly, to make sure that some of these gaps are covered. Now, obviously, it's easier said than done. So it will be our job to hold those folks accountable. I feel fairly confident, though, that APS will do the right thing, and APS will ensure that these families have the resources to be able to provide that distance education to their children. Now, you touch on something that is critical here, and that, you know, these are the families that perhaps absolutely have to work. And as we know, immigrant families, specifically undocumented immigrant families, do not qualify for any of the federal benefits or even state benefits that are afforded right now, whether it's unemployment benefits or stimulus checks or any of that sort. And so those folks, you know, in many cases, absolutely have to leave the house to go work, you know, in whatever trades they're in. And that's a complicating factor. So we are working actively with the state to identify some sort of program to help support those families. We are happy to report that, you know, 2-3 weeks ago, the state sent $400 EBT cards to every student who qualifies for free or reduced lunch, which has been a big help to our community, but more remains to be done. And we will be working closely with our district here to make sure that families have access to the information, to the training, to the technical assistance, and we will be engaging parents. As you saw in the survey, families are more than willing to engage with other parents and with schools in virtual settings. And organizations like ours are working very hard to make sure that we are providing programming to families through Facebook Live and other virtual means. Joanna or Marcela, I don't know if you'd like to add anything for your specific districts in Santa Fe or in Las Cruces. All right, so we'll go, oh, there you are, okay.
Thank you, Javier. Sorry about that. I was hoping Marcela would jump in first. Hi, everyone. Joanna Bencomo, Executive Director with New Mexico Cafe. Honestly, you know, this on the education end, we're really following the lead of our partners, that Partnership for Community Agency and Adrián abriendo puertas. For us at Cafe, the thing that's most important is, and we've been doing this with a lot of our partners statewide since this pandemic began, is just really bridging the communication gap and ensuring that our families have good information, in relevant information in Spanish. And so for us, that will continue to be on this education, and it will continue to be our priority, just to ensure that families get to have that information that they desperately need, you know, in order to plan ahead for their families. And so we will continue to do that for our school district down here.
And that's basically what I was going to say, Joanna. So thanks. We have a really great partnership with the Santa Fe Public School District here in Santa Fe. Of course, Somos Un Pueblo Unido is a statewide organization, and we this is part of a much larger poll about just sort of all of the challenges that familias are facing, both economic and educational, in our communities as a result of the pandemic. And so really our working group, all of the organizations that commissioned this poll, really have been working since late March, to really narrow the information gap between governments, school districts, cities, counties, the state, and local Spanish-speaking immigrants and communities, because we are, for the most part, immigrant-based and community-based. And so we enjoy a really great relationship here. We've done testing events with our with both DOH as well as with our friends at the Santa Fe Public School District. And we will be asking Dr. Sanchez to brief the school board and others at the Santa Fe Public Schools very shortly so that they have more information. Basically, we're really working to make sure that as much information to our policymakers about how our communities are dealing with this pandemic is there, and that way others in their different fields can advocate for the policies that they feel are grounded in community and in our communities.
Thank you, Marcela. Mayra, any follow-up questions before we move on to the next one?
Just one more. So I know you talked about the EBT, and that was a great news for all the families. But have you guys talked about maybe other help, financial help for internet? I know that some companies have where you only pay, I think, $20. I'm not sure how much is that per month, but I don't know if you guys have talked about that, about other financial help, especially for internet.
So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, we are working on some sort of assistance program for people who don't qualify for federal support, whether it's unemployment or stimulus checks, and that's in process. That would be more of a cash assistance program at some point, hopefully. In terms of internet, we know that local governments are stepping up. Here in our city, Albuquerque, we know that our mayor has you know, deployed internet through city buses and you know, by allowing people to, you know, park outside libraries, for example, to access it. We know companies like Comcast have stepped up and provided very inexpensive service to families who need it. You know, but I think that, you know, at the end of the day, as with many things related to COVID is exposing a set of inequities that go back generations, and access to internet, access to broadband, especially in Native American communities, is virtually non-existent. The state has not made the investments necessary to ensure that New Mexico is connected in the ways that it should be. And I think that this pandemic is really exposing that issue. So in the short term, we hope that companies like Comcast and local governments can step up and provide that access. But this is a much longer horizon that we need to be looking at. And access to broadband, I think, is one of those critical components. And to dovetail on that question, I do have a question from Patrick Hayes. Unless, Mayra, did you have anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you. We have one question from Patrick Hayes from KOB, and it's related to technology. And the question is the following: knowing that there's a need for more technology in these homes, who should pay for it? Is it the families, districts, or governments? I'll take a stab into that, but you know, anybody on this call, please feel free to jump on as well. You know, I think, Patrick, in many ways, this is a function of government. And if we as government have decided that schools physically need to remain closed and that we are going to rely on technology to fulfill our constitutional duty to our children, then we have to step up and make those services available. Kudos to districts like APS, who at the end of last school year gave a laptop to families who needed one across the district. I understand that there are more plans to do that as well. But let's remember that the hardware is only one part of the story, right? You still need to understand how to use the software in order to make the technology work for you. So I really do believe that this is something that government needs to step up and ensure that children have, with the help of school districts as well, and with the help of the private sector. You know, I think the private sector as well has a big role to play in these discussions. And you know, I'm glad that companies like Comcast have realized that and are working diligently to make sure that our families are connected. Does anyone else want to add anything to that answer? Dr. Sanchez?
I'll just add really briefly that unfortunately, let's keep in mind that for large segments of our rural residents of the state of New Mexico, including many Hispanic and Native American families, because they don't have access to broadband, they couldn't buy access to high-speed internet even if they had the resources to do so. So I think that structural challenge is something we often overlook. Even if they have the money to be able to buy in, they can't because there's not access to broadband, which is needed for high-speed internet. And a lot of folks say, well, how important is high-speed internet? Any of us that have children here know as you're trying to download or upload assignments for your kids' education, if you don't have high-speed internet, it's impossible to do that. So I think that's the one piece to keep in mind. Sometimes it's not just about fiscal responsibility. Basic access might not even be there.
And I would also add that, you know, as Dr. Sanchez indicated earlier, that the data shows that families are already carrying the weight of higher expenses for internet access, right? That families reported having to pay more during this pandemic for internet services. Also on the Latino Decisions website, you'll find that, you know, the economic data shows that about half of Latino families have tapped into their savings and have under $1,000 in their savings account, as well as for emergencies. So families are already facing immense economic pressures. They have already tapped their savings to be able to survive job loss and income loss. And this is really the time that government and school districts need to step in to support families during this, what districts will impose with distance learning requirements.
Thank you both. Any other questions from members of the media before we adjourn? Okay. Remember that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you. We're always available for questions. If you need to reach out to us, you can find our phone numbers, our cell numbers, and our email addresses here in the chat box. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you once again, Dr. Sanchez, for your work on this project. Thank you to our partners at Abriendo Puertas, New Mexico Café, Somos un Pueblo Unido, el Centro de Igualdad de Derechos, New Mexico Voices for Children, and Partnership for Community Action. We appreciate your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.